Okay, so today we are loading our high fire glaze kiln. Beauty of this kiln is it's a shuttle kiln, which means that the base of it moves out of the kiln, so we don't have to actually like reach into the kiln. So it makes it really nice when you're working on larger things. It's also much easier to like just load in general. Little heads up on this. This is what's called a downdraft kiln. So in the back of the kiln, at the very bottom corners, there are two burners, okay? And those burners have a mixture of gas and air forced into the kiln. So they're forced air burners as well. So those, the gas comes into the kiln in the back corners, okay? And then it hits what's called a target brick. So there's these bricks on each side, and they're at a very specific distance from the burner port to that brick. Changing that distance, these little side bricks, changing that distance actually changes how the kiln fires, because the flame comes in, okay, through the ports, hits that target brick, and then the flame starts to tumble, and it's directed basically by those target bricks. So whenever you're loading or unloading a kiln, you really want to try to avoid ever touching those, because moving those even just like 1/8 of an inch can like change like how well the kiln fires, okay? So we always like are really kind of like protective of those, because it takes a little time to get the kiln like dialed in. But yeah, so the fire comes in, hits those target bricks, goes, the flame path will start to rise up, right? It hits the top and it starts to tumble down through the work here inside the kiln, and then out through what's called the flue hole, okay? So then flame tumbles down, it goes out through that, and then up the chimney. Inside the chimney, we have what's called a damper. The damper opens and closes, right? And that will restrict or enhance the amount of flow going through the kiln. So that's one of the main devices that we use to actually create what's called reduction, right? Who remembers what reduction is? Who wants to be brave? I think I heard it. Yeah, Stephanie?
Reduction of oxygen?
Yeah, it's reduction of oxygen. So what happens is if we keep the gas in the air like at a very high rate, okay, it's coming into the kiln, if we close that damper down, that actually restricts the flow inside the kiln, okay, of the atmosphere moving through the kiln. So it reduces that, right? And by reducing that, if you have all that fuel still going into the kiln, it'll start to eat up all the oxygen, not all the oxygen, but it starts to eat up the oxygen and the molecules of the clay and the glazes, and that's how your clay and glazes really do transform, change color, and you'll see a lot more of the irons and the coppers really start to like really alter in that. So that's what we're doing today. So this lower level here, you'll see these bricks along this lower wall. Okay, so this is called a kiln shelf. Okay, kiln shelf makes sense. And these are what we call baffle bricks. B-A-F-F-L-E, baffle bricks. And this keeps the flame, because the flames come in at the bottom, this keeps the flame going up into the kiln instead of it hitting this work and then going right back out the flue, okay? So these baffle bricks, these also have to be here at the lower level, which means at the lower level we also need to have kind of high. So we just have these, this kiln furniture, these stilts in the same spot. Like every time, we always start with this high tall work first, and then we go short above it, and then we can do tall work above that, okay? And that's specific to this kiln. Not all kilns are like this. This is one specific design. It works for us really well. We love this kiln. It's amazing. So this lower level here has always our larger work, or some of our larger work, up until this height, which I believe is 12 inches, because these are 9-inch bricks. So we'll start, once we layer everything down here on the lower level, then we build up from that, right? And I'll start to put in shelves. And the shelves are made from silicon carbide. They can go to really high temperatures, okay? These are kind of a thinner, these are what are called pacer shelves. They're a little thinner, they're a little nicer. So it makes it a little easier to load, especially when you're doing the high levels. It's a little easier on your pack. So we really like these shelves a lot. So those are our kiln shelves. So what I'm going to do right now is I'm going to go ahead and actually put shelves on here. The beauty of, we don't have all the tall work here yet. There's more that we'll put in you always want to like get stuff kind of close together inside of the kiln to maximize space, right? We want to get as much in each firing as we can. So if we only have enough work to fire maybe like the lower level, we're always going to wait till more work shows up, okay? Because it's inefficient. Every time we fire these kilns, the kilns break down just little bit by little bit, right? You can look at the bricks inside here. They start to kind of crack and break, and they'll shed a little bit because these go through a lot of stress, right? So it's best that you actually maximize as much work in there as possible, because it takes about the same amount of fuel and energy to fire a full kiln as it does to fire half full kiln, okay? So might as well use that energy wisely, right? Especially if you have your own kiln in your own home studio. So I generally like to place things when I'm loading the kiln, within. Well, I like to be able to maybe just stick my finger in between pieces. You never want work touching inside of a glazed kiln. Why would that be? Why don't you want stuff touching in a glazed kiln? Yeah. It could fuse together, that's right. So like, glaze melts, pieces are touching, both those glazes are melted, boom, you've got a marriage that was not intentional, right? So that's something to be aware of. So I generally like to, somewhere like 1/4 of an inch or so in between pieces, because also what's happening when the pieces are firing, they're getting hotter, right? What happens to things when they heat up? They expand. So they actually get taller and they a little bit wider, right? It's like a percentage, and every clay body is different, but everything will expand just slightly. So it's always really important that you make sure that you allow for that. So you never want anything like right up next to like the baffle bricks. You never want anything right up next to the brick of the kiln, okay? Because that'll damage the kiln. You obviously don't want anything touching, any of the work touching. Another thing to always look out for is there's a really tall piece right here. I don't know if you guys can see it. It's about 3/4 of an inch lower than where the top of the stilt is, and that's like in the safe zone. Anything with like in a 1/2 inch or 1/4 inch of a shelf above it, that's like danger zone. I've pulled up kiln shelves in the past when I'm unloading a kiln, and I'll see a cup. It's like stuck to the bottom of a shelf because there was like a little bit of gap, maybe like a 1/16 or an 1/8 of an inch, before the firing started, and then during the firing, the cup expanded and it fused to the shelf above it. Okay. So that really does happen. The pieces will shrink back down eventually when they cool down, right? After it reaches its peak temperature. But when it's at its peak temperature, those pieces are a little bit larger than they are when they're cool. Does that make sense? Yeah. So that's something else to be aware of. So now that I've got the lower level, it's mostly stacked. The beauty of this kiln, we can pull these baffle bricks out and load stuff underneath areas if we load above it, okay? And which is what we're going to do today, later today, as more large work starts to show up. But for right now, what I'm going to do is I'm going to take these shelves. I always want to make sure that they're clean, that they don't have any of this kiln wash. So this top part, that's called kiln wash. That protects the shelf. It also protects your pieces, because your pieces will even like the porcelain or the stoneware, they melt like a little bit, right? And they can stick to things even without any glaze. So this, the kiln wash is a really nice buffer between the shelf and your piece. It also protects the shelf, so if there's any glazes that fall off or drip down the side of your pieces, it protects the shelf, because these are really expensive. We want to keep reusing them, right? So, never want to make sure there's any kiln wash underneath, which is when we stack these over here and we unload the kiln, we always put bottom to bottom and top to top, okay? So you see this top over here, it gets like this. The next shelf, if I were to unload, I put like the side with no kiln wash next to that, okay? Because that's a really important thing, because that kiln wash, if it sticks here during the firing, it might fall off and it'll drop into a pot. When it drops into the pot, it's there forever, okay? Once your glaze melts, it accepts that little detritus, and then it's like stuck in there forever, and it can ruin your work, right? So that's something always to be aware of. Whenever you're loading, you don't want things to drop into the pieces below it, because it will ruin it, okay? So I'm gonna take this shelf now. We load, or we arrange the kiln furniture so that each shelf is held up by 3 posts. It's a 3-post system. If you have 4 posts, like one at like say each corner, there's always gonna be one corner that's lower than the other 3, and you're gonna get this like rocking sensation, right? And then you post above those posts and you have all this weight down on those areas. And what happens is the shelves can warp and break. And sometimes that happens during a firing. I have seen that happen during a firing, and all the work is just like crashed during yeah, it's bad news bears. So always post on a 3-post system, okay? And you always wanna make sure wherever you're placing your posts that there's a post below it, okay? You always wanna go straight up with your posts throughout the whole stacking, so that way everything is supported. So I would never wanna put you know, the posts like in the middle here or in these back corners. It's always above the other posts. Make sense? Okay. Sorry to take more than 5 minutes, guys. So I'm going to do that. I get long-winded. I can't help it. I also, you can leave a little gap between the shelves. At the lower level though, I don't normally like to do that, just because it's a little more stable. Okay, you guys see this shelf? This has, looks like a little bit of paper. Someone must have fired, oh, you can see this residue here. Someone had fired on top of a piece of drywall. That's just like the paper, so it's just gonna, it's basically just ash. And then right here, they went to clean this up. Okay, this is a really good example. They went to clean this up and they added some more kiln wash to cover over a bad spot to make sure that their piece didn't stick to glaze or something. And they got some kiln wash on the side here. We got to get rid of that. And the reason why is that can come off during the firing and drop into the pieces below it. So sometimes when I'm loading the kiln, I'll also have a wet sponge in a bucket next to me, and I'll just wipe down the sides of things. So that way none of that stuff falls into anything else below it. So what I'm going to do is knock this off. Very elegantly. And I want to make sure this post, we've got enough room on this post for the next shelf. So I want to make sure these shelves touch so it's much more stable because they are so tall. Okay. So you always want to kind of like check your shelf, your posts to make sure they're sitting well and flat. And sometimes I'll give it just like a little jiggle to see how good it stands. This one's moving just a touch. So I'll adjust them by just like lifting up the shelf in one spot. There we go. So I'll just like pick up this corner. This one seems like it's off. There we go. So I just give it a little pressure, just kind of give it a little jiggle. It's always going to have a little bit of movement. That's just kind of what it is. The other thing is these posts, you know, that kiln wash, it'll like attach itself sometimes to the posts. So I like to rub the bottoms of those off a little bit usually to make sure that the shelves are sitting stable. So now we're ready to actually start loading more work in here. So one note about that is to help maximize space. One of the best things you can do to maximize space inside of a kiln is load everything that's the same height together on the same shelf, okay? And then you match up the kiln furniture, which is like the posts, to just a little bit taller than that, like I said, you know, at least like a 1/4 inch taller. So that way we can get as many shelves in here as possible, okay? So I don't want to have like something really tall next to like a plate, you know, and then I got a bunch of low stuff on this shelf. I've got one tall piece, so I got a post above the one tall piece, and this is all wasted area. Does that make sense? So I might lose out on being able to like stack a whole another shelf worth of stuff in there. So yeah, I mean, this is like, it's a version of Tetris that we're doing here. We're always trying to like fit things together, and we're also trying to like maximize space. So it's like loading a dishwasher and playing Tetris at the same time. If you guys are really good at loading dishwashers, loading a kiln is pretty similar. It's all about maximizing space, okay? So now I'm gonna like start to identify stuff by height. We kind of already have that here. So we've got stuff here that's about like 4 inches tall. Then we got things over here that are about 2.5, maybe 3 inches tall. So I'm gonna start to grab the shortest stuff. I always want to start with the shortest things possible when I'm loading a kiln. If I didn't have to deal with the baffle brick down here, we would have started with like plates or really low stuff at the very bottom. And then all the other kilns, I always start with like the lowest stuff. And that it has to do completely with stability, okay? So yeah, so I'm gonna start to load in these shorter lower works. And one thing a lot of people like to do, and I like to do this too, is I'll actually post up where the posts go. So I don't put work in that spot. So it's kind of like reserving that like real estate. So I can also go over here, and we keep a lot of our posts here in this middle section. So these are our 3-inch, these are our 4-inch. So that's pretty tall, that's a lot of extra space. I'm gonna actually go down to this height. These are our 3s. So these are our 3-inch. So I'm gonna place these. I like to also place them next to the work. And sometimes I'll place them over here, like on the shelves when I'm starting to like load stuff up, and I match things up to it. I was like, okay, that'll fit there, you know, and I'll like put posts throughout so I know which height I'm trying to match. So I'll put those where they go, so that way work doesn't go there. Always make sure you're putting a post right above another post. And then the next thing is, I'm dealing with the height. What I like to do is always load the widest things, because then I can fit the smallest things around it, right? This is like loading a dishwasher. You always start with the big stuff, little things fit around the big stuff. Make sense? All right, so I'm gonna start that. And I don't have the full selection here. I'd probably be bouncing back and forth between the kiln and the shelf where we have all the other high fire stuff. But I can get it kind of tight in there. And we're gonna have to really maximize this kiln because we got a lot more work showing up later today and tomorrow actually. So yeah, once I load this whole area, then I do another shelf above that. And I load up until, you know, we run out of space or we run out of work. This kiln is going to be 100% maximized due to all the work that's here and ready for us. Another note, as I'm loading, always pay attention to the bottom of your pieces. We've got we don't have a good term for it. We got the reject shelf over there. The reject shelf doesn't mean that your work is bad or anything. It just means that you didn't wipe any glaze off the bottom of your piece. Okay, if you got glaze on the bottom of your piece and you don't wipe it off, you're gonna probably find it over on the reject shelf because we're loading so much stuff. You know, we really do ask that you guys take that responsibility that you make sure you have no glaze on the bottom. Because obviously, what happens to your pieces if there's glaze on the bottom? They stick to the shelf. Absolutely. They might even stick to other people's work. So
Cleaning shelves is a lot of fun.
yeah, cleaning shelves is not fun. It's like the worst job in the world. That's why, you know,
Try soda chip every shelves.
totally. So yeah, so we'll load that all the way up here today. Once we load it up, ever so slowly and gently, we'll push it in, okay? And then this kiln is fully programmable gas kiln. So this is like, you know, it's kind of a rarity. Most gas kilns, you have to actually fire by hand, essentially. You're turning up the gas, you're playing with the damper, you're adding more air, whatever. But this kiln, we can fully program. It tells the gas burners how often to fire, so it can raise temperature at a very specific rate. Then it tells the kiln damper when to go in and out based on the amount of oxygen that's available in the kiln, because we want it to go into reduction at a specific temperature, okay? And then once it gets to the right temperature, the kiln shuts off, damper closes, and this is all done by the computer, and then we unload it like a day or two later after it's cooled. So that's it. You guys have any questions about that? No questions? Okay. Thank you so much. You guys can stop that.